So in here we've got a James. Well, it's a watch. It's the new Timex James brand collab piece. Now I covered this new model a couple of weeks back on the newsletter, and I overwhelmingly received the same response that people liked it, but they thought it was likely too expensive. I think this watch is launched at maybe $750 US, and while it seems to have some pretty decent specs, which I'm sure I'll have a look at in a second, I think a lot of people are still hesitant to pay that much for a Timex. But yeah, let's delve into this and see what you get with this whole package. Thanks to James Brand for sending in this review sample, which I think I can keep. They still haven't replied to my email, so just assume that. But yeah, they've had no say in this video, and I'll give my honest first impressions, or at least I'll try to. Let's have a look what's in this sleeve first of all, because often you get sleeves with a watch. Now, I actually don't know a great deal about the history of James Brand. They're like an EDC company, although it's got a lot of the usual jargon. Thank you for being James. James is an idea. Now, this sort of thing, I'm going to be honest, it's never appealed to me. That sort of aspirational family-style marketing is not really my cup of tea, to be honest. I'm more bothered about the actual product, and that's what we'll get to now. Let's have a look and see what one of the most expensive Timex watches ever actually gets you. I'll leave a link to it in the video description if you want to check it out. Now, one thing I will say about the James Brand is, unlike a lot of collab watches where they are absolute cash grabs and total gimmicks, this one seems to make a fair deal of sense, and that's because obviously James Brand is a everyday carry company who already makes similar products to this. Now, how do I get this out? There we go. Grab that, maybe? Well, I've been defeated by the packaging, but there we go. And while I'm not into everyday carry stuff, the branding is extremely minimal, which suits watches quite well. It's not plastered with bright, weird colors or weird logos. The logo, as I'm sure we'll see in a second, is really small on this watch, just like the previous version, which is pretty decent. Here we have the Timex James Brand Titanium GMT, and this is the second iteration of it. The first one released in a black colorway, and it was one of these watches that was on my radar, but I was too slow to get to it. It sold out almost immediately. And this one's also a limited edition, I think. This is the same watch again, just with like an emerald color scheme. Now, a couple of things straight out of the box. I think maybe it looks a bit smaller than I expected. What size did it say on the spec sheet? So it says 41 millimeters, but perhaps because the lug to lug is extremely short, it certainly looks smaller than 41. This is going to wear small for a 41. And another thing that's also caught my eye is this bit of the bracelet where it integrates with the case. Now, this is the first time I've quite seen an integration, or at least an attempt at an integration like this. It seems to have like a separate section, and then the typical bracelet starts. Now, at first, this looks like this whole section would come away, does it? It's got a quick release bracelet, which is nice, so you can change it quick. I know it does stay in there, so gives you like a half integrated look, but not quite. Normally when you have watches like this where the lugs are kind of integrated, the whole thing appears as one section, whereas this kind of gives you like a faux segmented area. That's quite unusual. I don't think I've seen that before. Not sure if I like it or not. But anyway, first impressions of the rest of the watch. I think the case is actually substantially better than I thought. So this is titanium, and it's listed in some places as this weird string of numbers, 6AL-4V titanium. Now, because they haven't got back to me yet, I had to lob this in ChatGPT instead. And they told me that means it's actually grade 5 titanium. Now, grade 5 titanium is like a essentially better version of titanium than the typical titanium used in a lot of watches. So cheaper watches like this here, which is the infamous Loris Field watch, that's also titanium, absolute fraction of the price of this one, but this is almost certainly grade 2 titanium, which means it is a tiny bit lighter, but it performs much worse when it comes to scratches, apparently. Now, I might put that to test at some point with another one of these scratch tests, but normally these grade 5 watches, they are more expensive. But yeah, I think the case, it looks great actually from side on. It looks really nice from side on. I think overall the watch is good looking, is what I also thought with the original black version of this watch that launched. The only concern that I had, and to an extent still have, is just the main bulk of the dial. Just think it looks a bit flat at this price. Like, it doesn't look bad. The color itself is nice, but it just looks pretty plain and, dare I say, a little bit cheap, which is a shame because I think the actual main case looks really good. And it's also got some top tier specs. It's got sapphire crystal, Miyota 9075 GMT in the back, and it's got 20 ATM water resistance too. So it's got all the specs that you'd want. It's just when you're spending that much, I don't know, I think you just want a dial that just has a slight bit more pizzazz about it potentially. But nevertheless, the design is on brand for this brand. They are focused on minimalism, and the only obvious sign that this is a collab piece is just that tiny logo above 6. But I do like that it's not absolutely plastered all over the watch. Like, I can't stand some of these collab pieces where you can't escape the branding. That's how I feel with this bezel. So it's a unidirectional bezel. It's middle of the road bezel, I'd say there. There is definitely some back play with that. Here's a closer look at the watch. So they're calling this colour emerald green, which is pretty apt. It does look quite a bit like the Ben's Watch Club green in a way. One of the biggest challenges for this particular watch is probably that Timex has released the Expedition North titanium watch, which really is quite similar in a number of ways, but is a fair amount cheaper than this one. Now that one's sold out at the moment. I don't think that one was limited edition, but that one's also, you know, pretty good looking and may have some crossover with this piece. Let's have a closer look at this bracelet. So this bracelet looks fully titanium, even including the peripherals here. Maybe this one tiny bit here is steel perhaps, but I don't know, it all feels like titanium to me, which is quite rare because a lot of the titanium bracelets are titanium up until this point, and then the clasp is just made of steel. And that means that the balance of the piece shouldn't be thrown off by a really heavy clasp, which is nice. Now, the downside, as we know with butterfly clasps, is the lack of adjustability. You have to adjust in link-sized increments, which is a shame, but it does leave a very clean look. Alternatively, there is a strap, which I'll throw on here in a second. Here's a closer look at that case. I think the crown actually looks really good with that James brand green inside. And there's the opposite end. Doesn't have much protrusion out the back at all, actually. Should wear relatively flush to the arm. There's a bit of residue left on there from a couple of the stickers. They just wouldn't come off. But that's the Miyota 9075, which is a decent movement that you can get Swiss movements at this sort of price. So there's a look at it on my 6¼ inch wrist. Now, obviously my wrist isn't tailored particularly well to 41mm watches, but it certainly doesn't wear like a 41mm as anticipated. It fits maybe more like a typical 40mm watch, although it is quite stout. The shape reminds me a lot of the Seiko Mini Turtle, actually. The case has the typical super matte finish, as you can see, with that not quite silver effect, more like a grey to it. Overall, it looks decent, but my concerns about the kind of dial surface still remain, I think. The rest of the watch does look like a $750 watch, just that particular part lets it down a bit for me. Now, I've just had a quick look at the dial off camera, and it does look better in person, like slightly away from light sources, but I think this particular piece of sapphire is just really quite hazy, and it doesn't have the best clarity, which is reducing the contrast quite a bit. I think this could have done with like an improved treatment perhaps. But let's see how this looks on a strap. It ships with one by default, this rubber strap with like a textured rear and some breathable holes. Interested to see how this strap works with those peculiar lugs too. As anticipated, I think this definitely would have suited the black dial watch more, this particular strap combination. For this green one, it does look better on the bracelet, gotta say. Tell you what though, very clever design with the strap, because those breathing holes also double up as the adjustment holes as well. So there's almost an unlimited stretch here, even if you have a wafer thin or a gigantic wrist. The strap will almost certainly fit you. It is very comfortable, I give them that. And you know, on wrist, it actually doesn't look nearly as bad with the strap as it did from just holding it. Maybe I jumped to conclusions a bit with that one. And before I forget, we should probably do sizing, and I'll also test the luminescence because it's got some pretty big markers. The markers themselves are almost presented as just blocks of lume standing by themselves, so it might have good low light performance, we'll see. But across the width, I've got it as 41.1, and that might be the bezel as the widest point. Yeah, bezel's exactly 41mm. Lug to lug is 47.8, and thickness 13.2. It doesn't look that thick. Actually, it looks quite thin, especially for 13mm. Looks like two different colours of lume on there. No lume on the bezel though. And then I'd say given the presentation, that's actually relatively disappointing loom. The loom on the hands is quite good, but the markers have faded almost instantly there. I mean, they haven't faded completely, but within like 30 seconds, they're almost gone. As for my first impressions, well, I have to say I'm getting pretty good at predicting what I'm going to think of these watches, because my thoughts are near identical to what I was saying in the newsletter. It is well spec'd, it is also pretty good looking, and it's got some interesting things going on. It's clearly not just like a gimmick collab watch, but the price, as a lot of you guys alluded to, it is steep, I've got to say. I feel in a similar boat to the Sternglass Naus Pro that I recently reviewed on Ben's Watch Club. Good watch, just maybe a little bit too expensive. I'll affiliate link it in the video description if you do want to check it out. This is a limited release, so you might be too late by the time you see this, we'll see. But you can get a relatively similar look, even though it isn't a GMT, from the Orient Kamasu. That green dial version is a similar tone to this, kind of similar handset with all the sharp accents, but obviously this one does have the titanium case.